I left before the speeches started, and what my father said to me in the parking lot that night gave me back something I didn't know I'd been slowly losing for 3 years. Her name was Sabrina. I met her at a work function in downtown Calgary. One of those charity galas where everyone's dressed like they belong somewhere important and half of them are pretending. I was there because my company had bought a table. She was there because her family had donated one of the auction items. We ended up talking for 2 hours near the back bar, ignoring the silent auction entirely. And by the end of the night I had her number and a feeling in my chest I hadn't felt in a long time. She was warm, funny, the kind of person who remembered small details. 3 weeks after we met, she asked me what my father did for a living. I told her he'd worked in manufacturing most of his life, that he'd retired early, that he spent most of his time in his garage or out on the lake. She smiled and said that sounded lovely. I believed her. I should tell you about my father before I go any further, because he matters more to this story than anyone else in it. His name is Frank Morell. He grew up in a small town outside of Sudbury, Ontario, the youngest of 4 boys, and his family didn't have money. Not struggling, exactly, but close enough that he understood from a young age what it meant to work for things. He left home at 18, found work in a machine shop in Hamilton, and spent the next 30 years learning how things were built and how to fix them when they broke. He wore the same style of work boots his whole life. He drove used trucks. He cut his own firewood every autumn and stacked it himself along the side of the house, even after he didn't need to anymore. He never told me we were wealthy. He never told me we weren't. What he told me was that money was a tool, not a trophy, and that people who treated it like a trophy usually ended up revealing something unflattering about themselves. I was 38 when I got engaged to Sabrina. Her family, the Kellers, were old Calgary money. Her father, Hugh, had built a commercial real estate portfolio across Alberta starting in the 80s. Her mother, Liz, ran their social life like a second career. They had a house in Elbow Park, a place in Kelowna they called the Cottage, even though it had 4 bedrooms and a heated dock, and an opinion about everything, delivered with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told you were wrong. I met them for the first time about 4 months after Sabrina and I started dating. Sunday dinner at their house. I wore a collared shirt and brought a good bottle of wine. Hugh shook my hand firmly and looked me over in a way that felt like an assessment. Liz smiled with her whole face, but her eyes were doing something else. They asked about my work. I was in commercial logistics, had started my own company 6 years earlier, and seemed satisfied enough. They didn't ask about my family that night. I didn't think much of it. The first time my father met Sabrina, we drove out to his place in Airdrie on a Saturday afternoon in October. He had soup on the stove when we arrived. His garage was open, some kind of engine project in progress. He wiped his hands on a cloth when we pulled up and walked out to meet us with the same unhurried pace he had for everything. Sabrina was polite, engaged even. She asked him questions. He answered them in the straightforward way he had, not performing anything, just talking. She laughed at the right moments. On the drive back, she said he seemed like a good man. I told her he was. She squeezed my hand. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The dinner conversations with Liz started small. Comments about the neighborhood where I grew up in Mississauga. Questions about where my father had gone to school, framed as curiosity, landing as something else. Once, and I've never forgotten this, she referred to men who worked in trades as not really the entrepreneurial type. She said it in the context of something else. She was talking about a contractor who'd done work on their cottage. I didn't respond. I told myself I was being too sensitive. Sabrina and I got engaged in February. We went to her parents' house to celebrate with them the following weekend. Hugh opened champagne. Liz cried and hugged her daughter for a long time, then turned to me and said she was so glad Sabrina had found someone established. That was the word she used. I let it pass. We started planning the wedding. Sabrina wanted something meaningful and a little formal. A venue near Canmore, dinner for around 160 guests, a sit-down meal, dancing after. I thought it sounded perfect. What I didn't anticipate was how thoroughly Liz intended to run the entire operation. She had opinions about every detail. The flowers, the menu, the invitation font, the seating chart. That last one is where things started to unravel for me, though I didn't see it clearly until much later. I brought my father to the venue walkthrough 6 weeks before the wedding. He wore a clean flannel shirt and his good jeans, his version of dressing up, and one I'd known my whole life. He was quiet during the walkthrough, asked a few practical questions about parking and access, and thanked the venue coordinator by name when she was done. On the drive back, Liz mentioned to Sabrina, not to me, to Sabrina, that it might be a bit cozy to have my father seated with the main family table given the aesthetic they were going for. She said it gently, like she was doing everyone a favor. Sabrina didn't push back. She told me later it wasn't a big deal, that the seating would work out fine, that her mother just had a vision for the head table. I said okay. I don't know why I said okay. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Canmore the night before the wedding. The Kellers had chosen it, a place with white linen and a prix-fixe menu and small candles on every table. My father arrived alone. My mother passed away when I was 26, wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before. He sat at the end of a table and ate his meal, and laughed at a story my cousin told, and didn't seem uncomfortable for a single moment. I watched him most of the evening. He was the most comfortable person in the room. Hugh gave a toast. It was about Sabrina and what a privilege it was to watch her grow into the woman she had become. It mentioned me briefly, and the man she's chosen, which is verbatim, and then circled back to Liz and the family and what this meant for their legacy. Legacy. He used that word. I looked at my father. He was listening politely, his hands folded on the table, his expression neutral. The wedding day itself was September. Clear sky. The mountains were extraordinary. I remember standing at the front of the ceremony space thinking that none of it felt real yet, that it would feel real once I saw her walk toward me. And it did for a moment. She was beautiful. She was smiling. I thought, standing there, that I had done everything right. The reception started well. People were eating, the wine was good, the speeches from Sabrina's side were polished and warm. My father was seated at a table near the back of the room. Not a bad table exactly, but separated from the head table by enough distance that it felt deliberate. I'd seen the seating chart the night before. I hadn't said anything then. I was still telling myself it was fine. He was seated with two of my cousins, a family friend from my side, and two people I didn't recognize. I found out later they were acquaintances of Hugh's who hadn't fit elsewhere. My father is not the kind of man who complains about where he's seated. He would have introduced himself to those strangers and found out something interesting about them within 10 minutes. That's just who he is. The moment that changed everything happened during the gap between the main course and dessert. I was standing near the bar with my brother-in-law, Sabrina's older brother, a guy named Callum, who I'd always found tolerable, when I heard something. Not loud enough to carry across the room, but loud enough for me to catch it clearly from where I was standing maybe 4 meters away. Liz was speaking to one of her friends, a woman I recognized from the golf club they belonged to. I heard Liz say, and I am going to tell you exactly what she said because it is burned into me. He's lovely, but the father, God, look at him. He's like something you'd find at a yard sale. Her friend laughed, not loudly, just enough. I turned and looked at Sabrina. She was 2 meters away from her mother. I don't know if she heard it. I held that uncertainty for a long time afterward, but honestly, the longer I sit with it, the more I think she did. She was looking at her phone when I looked at her. She didn't look up. I walked to where my father was sitting. He was in the middle of a conversation with one of my cousins. Relaxed, a glass of water in front of him because he doesn't drink much. He looked up when I approached and smiled in the easy way he had, the way that meant everything was fine with him, and he was glad to see me. I said quietly, "Did you hear what she just said?" He looked at me. Then he looked across the room, briefly in the direction I'd come from, then back at me. He said, "I heard something." I said, "She called you," and I stopped. I couldn't finish it. He set down his glass and folded his hands on the table. He said, "Son, let me ask you something. Are you happy?" I didn't answer. He said, "Not right now, obviously, but I mean in general, with this, with her." I still didn't answer. Because the honest answer, standing there in a rented reception hall in the mountains, with my new wife 30 meters away, was that I didn't know. I had been so busy managing everything, managing Liz, managing Sabrina's expectations, managing my own discomfort for 3 years, that I had stopped checking in with myself about whether I was actually happy. He nodded, like my silence was its own kind of answer. I went back to the head table. Sabrina looked up and smiled at me when I sat down. A few minutes later, Liz leaned over from her chair and said something to Sabrina, and Sabrina laughed. I don't know what was said. I watched Liz's face while she spoke, and she looked perfectly pleasant and at ease with everything. The dessert came out. There was a fruit tart and a small square of wedding cake on every plate. Mine went untouched. I want to be honest about what happened next because I've turned it over many times, and I want to be fair about it. I didn't make a dramatic announcement. I didn't stand up and give a speech. I pushed back my chair about 20 minutes later, walked over to where Sabrina was now standing with her cousin by the dance floor, and I said I needed to speak with her privately for a moment. We stepped out through a side door into a hallway that led toward the venue's loading area. It wasn't romantic. There were folded up banquet chairs stacked against the wall. I told her what I'd heard. Exact words. She went very still. Then she said, "When?" I said, "During the break, she was talking to your Aunt Gwen." Sabrina pressed her lips together. She said, "My mother can be a lot." I said, "I know," she said. "She doesn't mean everything the way it comes out." I said, "Sabrina, she called him something you'd find at a yard sale. At our wedding, in front of her friends." There was a pause. Then she said, "I know, and it's awful, and I'll talk to her. But can we please just get through tonight, and I'll talk to her tomorrow, I promise." I looked at her for a moment. She looked back at me with the face of someone who was hoping very much that I would agree to get through tonight. She wasn't angry at her mother. She was managing me. I could see it clearly, all at once, the way sometimes you see something clearly only after you've been not seeing it for a very long time. I said, "Okay." I went back inside. I sat for another few minutes. I thought about the word Liz used, yard sale, and what it said about the kind of person she was. I thought about the seating chart. I thought about legacy. I thought about Sabrina, standing in that hallway, choosing the path of least resistance and hoping I'd go along with it. Then I got up and I walked to my father's table. He was still there. The cousins were on the dance floor. He was alone for a moment, nursing his water, looking out at the room with the same calm, unhurried expression he brought to everything. I said, "I'd like to go." He looked at me. He said, "You sure?" I said, "I am." He stood up, put his jacket on, and said, "All right." We walked out together. Nobody stopped us. The DJ was starting the first dance set, and the lights had dropped low, and everyone was watching the dance floor. We went through the main doors into the parking lot. The air was cold, the way September air in the mountains is cold at 9 o'clock, sharp and clean, and honestly something of a relief. We stood by his truck for a minute without saying anything. The mountains were black silhouettes against a sky that still had some light left in the west. I said, "I think I just ended my marriage." He said, "You think or you know?" I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'm sorry. Not good for you, or she wasn't right for you, or I never liked them anyway. Just, I'm sorry." Because he understood that even when something is right, it still costs something, and he wasn't the kind of man who pretended otherwise. I said, "She heard it, Sabrina." I think she heard what her mother said, and she let it go. He nodded once. I said, "Does it bother you?" What her mother said. He was quiet for another moment. A car pulled out of the far end of the parking lot, headlights sweeping across us briefly. Then he said, "People like that, they're afraid of something they can't name. I've met them my whole life. They need everything arranged just so because, if it isn't, they start to wonder what any of it was ever for." He looked out at the mountains. "I've never needed it arranged. I feel pretty good about that." I leaned against the truck. I didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "You should know something. About me. About us." I looked at him. He said, "I've been wanting to tell you for a while now. I was waiting for the right time, and I suppose this is as right as it's going to get." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me. I unfolded it. It was dark enough in the parking lot that I had to angle it toward the light coming from the venue windows. It was a summary statement from an investment account, the kind of summary that has a lot of columns and a total at the bottom. The total at the bottom had 8 figures. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at him. He said, "The machine shop in Hamilton eventually turned into 3 machine shops. Then I sold them and put the money somewhere sensible and left it there for 25 years. He paused. "Your mother knew. Nobody else needed to." I said, "Dad," he said, "the boots are comfortable. The truck runs fine. I like cutting my own wood." He shrugged. A small thing, the same shrug he'd used my whole life when something was self-evident. Didn't see the point in changing any of it. I stood in that parking lot for a long time trying to think of something to say. What I kept coming back to was Liz's voice, yard sale, and the image of my father sitting at that back table, perfectly at ease, not performing a thing, not needing a single person in that room to see him a certain way, and the image of Hugh giving that speech about legacy, holding his champagne glass like it was proof of something. My father put the paper back in his jacket pocket and looked at me. He said, "Whatever you decide to do next, the account is yours eventually anyway. But that's not the point. The point is, I want you to know that you never had to manage anything on my behalf. I was always fine." I understood then what he meant. He wasn't just telling me about money. He was telling me that for 3 years, I had been quietly editing myself, softening how I talked about him, explaining him in ways I thought would land better with certain people, sitting with discomfort I should have named out loud, and all of it had been unnecessary. He had never needed managing. He had never needed defending. He was fine. He had always been fine. The person who needed to hear that was me. I called Sabrina from the parking lot. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the music behind her, the room full of people. I told her I wasn't coming back in. She asked me if I was serious. I told her I was. She said we could talk about this tomorrow, that I was just upset, that I should come back, and we could get through the rest of the night and figure it out after. I told her I didn't think that was going to work. There was a long pause. Then she said, "You're really doing this," I said. "I'm really sorry, I am. But yes." She hung up. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand, and then I looked at my father, who was leaning against his truck, with his arms crossed, not saying anything, giving me the space to be whatever I needed to be. I said, "Can I come to your place tonight?" He said, "Course you can." We took his truck. He drove. He put on a CBC radio program about something to do with Northern Ontario and didn't say anything else about the evening until we were nearly back to Airdrie. Then, just before he turned off the highway, he said, "You did right. She would have managed you your whole life and called it love." I didn't respond. He didn't need me to. The next several months were difficult in the ordinary way that hard things are difficult. Lawyers. Calls with her family that didn't go anywhere. Conversations with Sabrina that were civil and sad and didn't really resolve into understanding for either of us. She told me once, toward the end of all of it, that she had heard what her mother said that night. She said she thought she could handle it by handling her mother privately and that she hadn't expected me to walk out. I told her I understood. I did, actually. I just didn't think understanding it changed anything. Hugh called me once, left a voicemail. Said he hoped we could be adults about this. I didn't call back. I went to see my father the following spring. He was out in the garage with a project going, same as always. I brought coffee. We sat on 2 old wooden stools he'd had out there for as long as I could remember and drank it while he explained what he was working on. An old outboard motor, something from the 70s, the kind of thing he enjoyed fixing for no reason except that he could. I asked him if he'd told anyone else, about the accounts, about all of it. He said not really. Said it didn't come up much. I said, "You could have lived anywhere, done anything." He said, "I do live somewhere, I do things." He adjusted something in the motor. "You have to be careful about what you mistake for a life." I thought about that for a long time on the drive back. About what gets mistaken for a life. The gala where I met Sabrina, the dinner parties at the Kellers, the seating chart. The way Hugh raised his champagne glass when he said the word legacy. My father cut his wood that fall, same as every year. I went out and helped him. We didn't talk much while we worked. We didn't need to. The sound of it, the splitting and the stacking, was enough. It was the kind of work that puts things back in order. The kind that asks nothing of you except to be present and do the next thing. I've started to understand what he was teaching me, not just that night in the parking lot, but my whole life. That worth isn't something you announce. That a man who needs a room to understand his value is always one room away from feeling like nothing. That the most solid ground you can stand on is the kind nobody else can take back. I don't know if I'll get married again. I'm not against it. What I know is that the next time I introduce someone to my father, I won't be watching her face to see how she reacts. I'll be watching her in the moments when she thinks nobody's looking. That's where the real information is. My father taught me that too, without ever saying it in so many words. He's still in Airdrie, still cuts his own wood, still drives a used truck. Last time I was there, he'd gotten the outboard running and was talking about taking it up to a lake north of Cochrane. He showed me the motor like it was something to be proud of, which it was not because of what it was worth, but because of what it had taken to get it running again. That's him. That's always been him. I just wish it hadn't taken a September night in a mountain parking lot for me to understand that I never needed to apologize for that. Not once. Not to anyone.